Behind the quiet suburbs of West London stands a facility few truly understand. High concrete walls, steel gates, and constant surveillance conceal a world shaped by anger, fear, and broken childhoods. This is HMP Feltham, one of the United Kingdom's most notorious young offender institutions. HMP Feltham is located in West London, an area surrounded by residential neighbourhoods, schools, and busy transport routes. From the outside, its presence is almost hidden in plain sight, blending into the urban landscape. Yet behind its high perimeter walls and razor wire lies one of the most challenging custodial environments in the UK youth justice system. Its location places it physically close to everyday civilian life, while psychologically existing in a completely different world. The institution sits in the London borough of Hounslow, a region marked by cultural diversity and stark social contrasts. Many of the young men held inside Feltham come from London itself, often from areas affected by poverty, gang activity, and social exclusion. This proximity means the prison is not an isolated remote facility. It is directly connected to the streets, communities, and social problems of the capital. As a young offender institution, Feltham plays a specific role within the prison estate. It is designed to hold young adult males, mainly aged between 18 and 21, who are transitioning from youth custody into the adult prison system. This age group is widely regarded as one of the most volatile and vulnerable in custody, combining physical maturity with emotional instability and underdeveloped impulse control. Feltham's identity has evolved over decades, shaped by policy changes and shifting approaches to youth justice. Originally intended as a place of discipline and reform, it has repeatedly been repurposed to manage rising numbers of young offenders in London. Each change has added pressure to an already strained institution, affecting its ability to maintain stability and safety. The prison's location also influences the population it receives. Courts across London frequently send young offenders to Feltham due to its accessibility and capacity. This results in a constant flow of inmates, many with ongoing street conflicts that do not end at the prison gates. Rivalries from outside are often carried inside, turning the wings into extensions of urban gang territories. Being situated in a major city brings additional operational challenges. Staffing shortages are harder to manage due to the high cost of living in London, while recruitment and retention of experienced officers remains a persistent issue. These pressures directly impact daily life inside the prison, reducing supervision levels and increasing risks. The surrounding urban environment also means Feltham is under intense public and media scrutiny. Incidents inside the prison quickly attract attention, sparking debates about youth crime, rehabilitation, and public safety. Its London location ensures that failures within the institution resonate far beyond its walls. In many ways, Feltham's geographical and institutional identity defines its reputation. It stands as a frontline facility, absorbing the consequences of social breakdown, youth violence, and systemic inequality in the capital. Its role is not only to detain but to manage the most complex and high-risk young offenders in one of Europe's largest cities. HMP Feltham primarily holds young adult males between the ages of 18 and 21, a stage of life marked by intense physical energy, emotional volatility, and incomplete psychological development. This age group sits at a critical crossroads, no longer children under the youth justice system, yet not fully mature adults capable of consistent self-control and long-term decision-making. Many of the young men arriving at Feltham have already experienced years of instability before entering custody. Broken family structures, exposure to street violence, school exclusion, and substance abuse are common threads in their backgrounds. By the time they reach this institution, criminal behavior has often become normalized, shaping their identity and sense of belonging. The transition from youth custody to a young offender institution is abrupt and unforgiving. In youth facilities, emphasis is often placed on care and supervision, but Feltham operates in a harsher custodial environment. This sudden shift can overwhelm inmates, triggering fear, aggression, and defensive behavior as they struggle to adapt to stricter routines and more dangerous surroundings. Young adults in this age bracket are especially prone to impulsive actions. Arguments escalate quickly, minor disputes turn violent, and peer pressure heavily influences behavior. Inside Feltham, respect is often enforced through intimidation, making confrontation a daily reality. For many inmates, showing weakness is perceived as a direct threat to survival. This population is also highly susceptible to gang influence. Many inmates arrive with established gang affiliations from their neighborhoods, while others are pressured into aligning with groups for protection. These alliances shape daily life, dictating where inmates can move, who they interact with, and how conflicts unfold inside the prison. Mental health challenges are widespread among this age group. Anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, and emotional immaturity are common, yet often go untreated or unnoticed. The combination of confinement, fear, and unresolved trauma creates an environment where self-harm and violent outbursts become coping mechanisms. Education and rehabilitation efforts face unique obstacles with this population. While some inmates show a willingness to change, others resist authority and structured learning. Short attention spans, distrust of institutions, and previous educational failure make engagement difficult, limiting the effectiveness of reform programs. The concentration of young adult males with high-risk backgrounds makes Feltham one of the most volatile institutions in the system. Their age, mindset, and life experiences collide within confined spaces, creating constant tension. Managing this demographic requires not only security, but deep understanding of youth psychology under extreme pressure. HMP Feltham has developed a reputation over many years as one of the most violent young offender institutions in the United Kingdom. This reputation did not emerge overnight. It is the result of repeated incidents, inspections, and internal reports that have consistently highlighted serious concerns about safety, control, and discipline. Violence at Feltham is not an exception to the routine. It has often been part of the daily reality. Assaults between inmates are a frequent occurrence, ranging from spontaneous fights to premeditated attacks. Minor disagreements over phones, food, or perceived disrespect can quickly escalate into serious violence. In an environment where reputation and dominance are crucial to survival, many young offenders resort to aggression as a way of establishing control or deterring future threats. Violence at Feltham is not limited to prisoner-on-prisoner incidents. Staff members have also been regular targets of verbal abuse, threats, and physical assaults. Officers working on the wings face unpredictable situations, often with limited backup. This constant exposure to danger places immense psychological strain on staff, affecting morale and increasing turnover. The physical layout of the prison contributes to the problem. Narrow corridors, confined communal areas, and locked cells intensify tension, especially during association periods. When large numbers of volatile young men are brought together in restricted spaces, the risk of confrontation rises sharply, leaving little room for de-escalation once tempers flare. Gang-related violence further fuels Feltham's dangerous reputation. Rivalries that begin on London streets are frequently carried inside, transforming wings into contested territories. These conflicts are deeply personal and often rooted in long-standing grudges, making them difficult to manage through standard prison controls. Weapons, though improvised, are another factor driving violence. Everyday items can be adapted into tools for attack, increasing the severity of incidents. The presence or rumor of weapons heightens fear and paranoia, encouraging preemptive strikes as a means of self-protection. Inspection reports over the years have repeatedly described a culture where violence becomes normalized. Young offenders quickly learn that reporting incidents can make them targets, leading to a code of silence. This culture allows aggression to spread unchecked, embedding it deeper into daily life within the institution. The cumulative effect of constant violence shapes the identity of Feltham itself. It influences how inmates behave, how staff operate, and how the public perceives the institution. Violence becomes both a symptom and a defining feature of a system struggling to contain and reform some of the most troubled young men in custody. HMP Feltham is deeply affected by gang culture, which shapes much of the daily life inside the institution. For many young offenders, gang identity does not begin in prison. It is brought in from the streets of London. These affiliations often define who an inmate trusts, where they can safely move, and how they must behave to avoid becoming a target. Inside Feltham, gangs function as informal power structures. They offer protection, status, and a sense of belonging in an otherwise hostile environment. For young men who have grown up without stability or support, gang loyalty can feel like survival rather than choice. Refusing to align with a group can leave an inmate isolated and vulnerable. Rival gangs from outside frequently find themselves housed under the same roof. Conflicts that originated in neighborhoods, schools, or housing estates continue behind prison walls. These rivalries are rarely resolved and instead intensify due to constant proximity, limited space, and the inability to escape confrontation. Gang culture heavily influences violence patterns within the prison. Assaults are often retaliatory, ordered, or symbolic rather than random. A single incident can trigger a chain reaction of attacks, creating cycles of revenge that spread across wings. This makes maintaining order extremely difficult for prison staff. New arrivals are particularly vulnerable to gang pressure. Younger or physically weaker inmates may be coerced into carrying out tasks, holding contraband, or acting as lookouts. Refusal can result in intimidation or violence, reinforcing gang dominance and control over everyday prison life. Communication networks within gangs operate quietly but effectively. Messages pass through coded language, gestures, and trusted intermediaries. Even under constant surveillance, gang members adapt quickly, finding ways to organize and enforce internal rules without drawing immediate attention. Gang loyalty often undermines rehabilitation efforts. Education classes, therapy sessions, and work programs may be avoided if they conflict with gang expectations. In some cases, showing interest in self-improvement is viewed as weakness or betrayal, discouraging positive change. The presence of entrenched gang culture transforms Feltham into more than a custodial facility. It becomes a continuation of the streets, where power, fear, and allegiance govern behavior. This environment challenges the very purpose of a young offender institution, as control shifts from formal authority to unofficial gang hierarchies. A defining feature of life inside HMP Feltham is that many of its young inmates arrive carrying deep and unresolved trauma. For a significant number, criminal behavior is not the beginning of their story. It is a symptom of early life experiences marked by neglect, abuse, and exposure to violence. These formative hardships often shape their worldview, making the structured environment of a prison both unfamiliar and threatening. Many inmates come from fractured family backgrounds, where parental absence, domestic violence, or substance abuse created instability from an early age. Some have been in and out of foster care or youth detention facilities, which adds layers of insecurity and mistrust. For these young men, authority figures are often associated with punishment rather than guidance, complicating relationships with prison staff. Exposure to street violence is another common thread. Many have witnessed or been victims of assaults, stabbings, or gang attacks before arriving at Feltham. These experiences ingrain a survivalist mentality, distrust of others, quick reactions to perceived threats, and a constant need to assert dominance. In prison, this mindset is magnified, as confined spaces and peer pressure intensify the sense of danger. Substance abuse and addiction also feature prominently in these traumatic backgrounds. Alcohol, drugs, or inhalants often become coping mechanisms for unprocessed pain. Upon arrival at Feltham, withdrawal symptoms or cravings can exacerbate agitation, aggression, and emotional instability, contributing directly to violent incidents. Psychological trauma is compounded by social disadvantage. Many inmates grew up in neighborhoods with high crime rates, poor educational opportunities, and limited access to mental health support. These factors limit their coping strategies and increase susceptibility to peer influence, making adaptation to structured routines particularly challenging. The psychological scars of trauma frequently manifest as self-harm, aggression, or hypervigilance. Young offenders may lash out at anyone they perceive as a threat, whether that is a fellow inmate, staff member, or even themselves. This creates a cycle where trauma begets violence, and violence reinforces trauma. Feltham staff must navigate these layered traumas while maintaining security. Officers often act as mediators, mental health responders, and disciplinarians simultaneously. Understanding the backgrounds of these young men is essential to anticipating behaviors, de-escalating conflicts, and preventing serious incidents. Ultimately, the prevalence of trauma among inmates underscores a harsh reality. Many of the challenges at Feltham are rooted not just in criminality, but in social and psychological harm accumulated long before these young men ever entered the institution. HMP Feltham is notorious for frequent assaults, both between inmates and against staff, which shape the daily rhythm of life inside the institution. Violence is not confined to rare incidents. It is a persistent reality, fueled by fear, rivalry, and the need to assert dominance. Young offenders quickly learn that aggression is a tool for survival, and any lapse in vigilance can be exploited. Assaults between prisoners range from impulsive, spontaneous fights to premeditated attacks planned over days. Minor provocations, such as insults, encroachment on personal space, or disputes over possessions, can escalate almost instantly. The confined environment of Feltham's wings leaves little room to de-escalate, making even small arguments potentially dangerous. Staff members are also frequent targets. Officers supervising wings face verbal abuse, threats, and physical attacks while attempting to maintain order. This constant exposure to risk creates high levels of stress, fatigue, and anxiety among personnel. Even experienced officers must remain vigilant at all times, aware that an unexpected confrontation could erupt without warning. Weapon-related violence is another concerning factor. Young inmates often improvise weapons from everyday objects, such as cutlery, toiletries, or even parts of furniture. The presence, or suspicion, of such weapons significantly escalates the risk of injury and increases the tension in communal areas, making normal routines fraught with danger. Gang conflicts intensify the frequency and severity of assaults. Rivalries carried over from the streets often continue inside Feltham, with attacks designed not just to harm, but to send messages and assert territorial control. Staff must constantly monitor interactions to prevent these disputes from spiraling into larger-scale incidents. The psychological impact of frequent assaults on both prisoners and staff is profound. Inmates may become hypervigilant, distrustful, or emotionally withdrawn, while staff can experience trauma, burnout, and moral fatigue. This atmosphere of tension further perpetuates the cycle of violence, as fear drives reactive and sometimes excessive behavior. Medical teams and prison officers must be prepared to respond immediately to injuries, but resources are limited. High assault rates stretch healthcare and emergency response capabilities, sometimes delaying treatment and heightening the severity of outcomes. Ultimately, assaults at Feltham are not isolated events. They are part of an ongoing, complex ecosystem of fear, survival, and control. Each incident ripples through the wings, affecting behavior, morale, and the overall stability of the institution. One of the most significant challenges at HMP Feltham is chronic staff shortages, which intensify operational pressure and directly impact safety. Officers are required to manage volatile young offenders, while often working with fewer personnel than recommended. This shortage affects supervision, response times, and the ability to implement rehabilitation programs effectively. The demanding environment inside Feltham places staff under constant stress. Officers must monitor wings filled with highly aggressive, impulsive young men, while simultaneously managing administrative duties, security checks, and prisoner movement. Fewer staff means fewer opportunities to intervene early in conflicts, leading to higher chances of assaults and escalation. Staff shortages also limit the ability to provide meaningful engagement with inmates. Time spent on routine patrols and crisis management reduces opportunities for officers to build rapport, mentor, or support young men in education and rehabilitation programs. In such conditions, relationships between staff and prisoners can become purely transactional, undermining trust and cooperation. Overtime is a frequent necessity, as officers are often required to cover gaps in staffing. This leads to fatigue and burnout, which can compromise judgment and reaction times in high-stakes situations. Exhausted staff may struggle to maintain control or respond appropriately during violent incidents, further endangering both themselves and inmates. Training and development opportunities are also affected. With reduced staff numbers, it becomes difficult to release personnel for professional development, crisis management courses, or trauma-informed practice training. This limits the institution's ability to adapt to the complex psychological and behavioral needs of the young population. Shortages exacerbate tensions within the prison environment. Officers must sometimes prioritize security over rehabilitation, focusing on containment rather than intervention. Inmates notice the reduced supervision, which can embolden aggressive behavior and gang activity, further destabilizing the wings. Management faces the continuous challenge of balancing limited resources with the need to maintain order. Recruitment difficulties in London, due to cost of living and high turnover, mean staffing shortages are persistent rather than temporary. The result is a cycle where pressure on staff fuels institutional instability, which in turn increases the demands on an already strained workforce. Ultimately, chronic understaffing at Feltham amplifies risks, undermines rehabilitation, and contributes to a culture of fear and volatility. The young men inside are left to navigate a high-stress, high-risk environment where staff presence is inconsistent, and safety is often fragile. HMP Feltham faces persistent issues with overcrowding, which significantly amplifies tension and volatility inside the prison. Originally designed to house a manageable number of young offenders, the facility often operates above capacity, forcing more inmates into limited space. This lack of room increases friction, escalates conflicts, and makes maintaining order a constant struggle for staff. Overcrowding affects daily life in multiple ways. Cells intended for 1 or 2 occupants may hold several inmates, reducing privacy and personal space. This constant proximity exacerbates stress and irritability, with minor disagreements quickly escalating into physical confrontations. The claustrophobic conditions leave little opportunity for inmates to retreat or cool down during tense moments. Communal areas, such as dining halls, exercise yards, and recreational spaces, become congested and difficult to manage. During association periods, large groups of young men are forced into confined spaces, creating opportunities for verbal disputes to erupt into fights. Staff are often stretched thin, unable to supervise every interaction effectively, which heightens the risk of violence. Overcrowding also places additional strain on prison resources. Healthcare services, education programs, and mental health support become overburdened, making it difficult to address individual needs. This lack of access can leave inmates frustrated, resentful, and more likely to act out aggressively, further compounding tension. The psychological impact of living in overcrowded conditions is profound. Young offenders often experience heightened anxiety, irritability, and hypervigilance, constantly scanning for threats in an environment where danger can appear unexpectedly. These stress responses contribute directly to aggressive behavior and reinforce the cycle of violence. Gang dynamics are intensified by overcrowding. Confined spaces force rival groups into constant proximity, making it easier for disputes to escalate. The inability to physically separate conflicting parties leaves officers with few options other than intervention, which can itself trigger resistance or aggression. Overcrowding also limits access to rehabilitation and educational programs. When wings are full, classes, workshops, and training sessions cannot accommodate all inmates, reducing opportunities for constructive engagement. This lack of meaningful activity leaves young men idle, increasing the likelihood of boredom-driven conflicts or rule-breaking. In essence, overcrowding transforms Feltham from a facility intended for rehabilitation into a pressure cooker environment. Physical congestion, coupled with social tension and limited resources, magnifies aggression, complicates staff supervision, and makes maintaining safety an ongoing challenge. HMP Feltham faces a persistent and serious challenge with self-harm and mental health crises among its inmates. Many young offenders arrive carrying emotional scars, trauma, and untreated psychological conditions, which are often exacerbated by the pressures of confinement. For some, self-harm becomes a coping mechanism, a way to exert control, express distress, or communicate pain in an environment where verbal expression is limited. The prevalence of self-harm incidents is closely linked to the volatility of Feltham's population. Inmates aged 18 to 21 are at a stage of heightened emotional sensitivity and impulsivity. Combined with the fear, stress, and aggression present inside the wings, these traits make young men particularly vulnerable to crises. Even minor conflicts or perceived slights can trigger extreme responses, including self-injury. Mental health support within the institution is often overstretched due to high demand. Psychologists, counselors, and healthcare staff must divide attention among a large population, leaving some young men without timely intervention. This can result in repeated incidents of self-harm, worsening psychological distress, and an escalating cycle of emotional instability. Gang dynamics and peer pressure can further complicate mental health issues. Some inmates may conceal their struggles for fear of appearing weak, while others may mimic self-harm behaviors observed in peers. The social environment often discourages open communication about mental health, leaving many to suffer in silence until crises become acute. Isolation, while sometimes necessary for safety, can exacerbate mental health problems. Segregation or single-cell confinement is often used as a response to aggressive behavior or risk of self-harm, but extended periods alone can intensify anxiety, depression, and feelings of hopelessness. In some cases, these conditions may escalate into suicidal ideation or severe psychological breakdowns. Substance abuse adds another layer of complexity. Many young offenders have histories of drug or alcohol use, which can interact with mental health conditions to increase impulsivity, aggression, and emotional instability. Withdrawal, cravings, or intoxication may trigger both self-harm and violent outbursts, making supervision and intervention more challenging for staff. Training and support for staff are critical in managing these crises, but limited resources often mean officers must respond reactively rather than proactively. Recognizing early warning signs, de-escalating tense situations, and providing emotional support requires skill and experience, which can be difficult to maintain consistently in a high-pressure environment. Ultimately, self-harm and mental health crises at Feltham are not isolated problems. They reflect the broader struggles of young offenders coping with trauma, confinement, and systemic pressures. Addressing these issues requires a delicate balance of care, security, and intervention, highlighting the complex reality of managing vulnerable yet volatile populations. HMP Feltham was designed to rehabilitate young offenders, but in practice, the institution faces profound challenges in achieving this goal. The pervasive fear, aggression, and unpredictability inside the wings often undermine efforts to encourage personal growth or behavioral change. Many young men arrive with entrenched patterns of violence and distrust, making rehabilitation a constant uphill struggle. Fear is a defining factor in inmates' behavior. Young offenders must navigate a world where even minor actions can provoke retaliation or gang-related attacks. In such an environment, the instinct to survive often outweighs willingness to participate in educational or therapeutic programs. This creates a tension between the institution's rehabilitative objectives and the harsh realities of prison life. Aggression, both learned and reactive, further complicates rehabilitation. Inmates may view authority figures, including educators and counselors, as potential threats. Any perceived challenge or criticism can provoke hostility, making it difficult to establish trust. Programs aimed at personal development often face resistance because young offenders prioritize immediate self-preservation over long-term goals. Gang influence is a significant barrier to effective rehabilitation. Many inmates are under pressure to conform to group norms, which may discourage engagement in courses, therapy, or skill-building programs. Acting against gang expectations can result in ostracization, intimidation, or violence, creating a constant deterrent to positive change. The structure and intensity of life at Feltham often limit access to constructive activities. Overcrowding, staff shortages, and security concerns mean that education, vocational training, and therapeutic sessions are disrupted or inadequately supervised. Young men may miss out on opportunities to develop skills, reflect on their choices, or engage in safe social interaction. Mental health issues intersect with fear and aggression to complicate rehabilitation further. Anxiety, trauma, and impulsivity can reduce attention spans, emotional regulation, and motivation. For many young offenders, the cognitive and emotional resources required to benefit from rehabilitation programs are depleted by the daily stresses of survival in the wings. Even well-designed programs must compete with the immediate realities of prison life. Meal times, association periods, and movement between wings are dominated by negotiation, avoidance, and defensive strategies. These routines leave little mental or emotional space for self-reflection or engagement in rehabilitation, often limiting programs to a theoretical rather than practical impact. Ultimately, the combination of fear, aggression, and environmental pressures makes Feltham a setting where rehabilitation is constantly challenged. While programs exist and some young offenders do respond positively, the overall effectiveness is limited by the relentless interplay of survival instincts, peer pressure, and institutional constraints. HMP Feltham offers education and skill training programs intended to prepare young offenders for life beyond the prison walls, but these initiatives face persistent obstacles. While the goal is to equip inmates with literacy, numeracy, vocational skills, and personal development, the volatile environment often undermines participation and engagement. For many young men, fear and mistrust outweigh the motivation to learn. The aggressive and tense atmosphere in the wings limits access to classrooms and workshops. Security concerns mean that movement is tightly controlled, and sessions may be cancelled or shortened if staff cannot safely supervise large groups. Consequently, even highly motivated inmates may struggle to attend consistently, reducing the overall effectiveness of educational programs. Disruptive behavior, both individually and collectively, further hampers learning. Inmates may arrive at classes late, refuse to participate, or intimidate peers and staff. This behavior is often rooted in fear, gang influence, or past trauma, but it creates an environment where meaningful instruction is difficult to deliver and maintain. Mental health challenges among the population also impede skill acquisition. Young offenders with anxiety, depression, or attention difficulties may find it hard to focus, retain information, or cope with structured learning. Without adequate psychological support integrated into education programs, Progress is often slow or inconsistent. Resource limitations contribute to the struggle. Feltham experiences overcrowding and staff shortages, meaning that qualified instructors and vocational trainers are often stretched thin. There may be insufficient equipment, learning materials, or space to run practical training sessions effectively. This restricts both the variety and quality of programs offered. Gang dynamics can undermine education and training initiatives as well. Participation in programs may be seen as a sign of weakness or disloyalty to peers, discouraging some inmates from attending. Others may be coerced into skipping sessions to maintain gang obligations, further disrupting consistency and learning outcomes. Despite these challenges, some inmates do engage with education as a pathway to personal growth. Those who participate consistently can acquire qualifications, vocational skills, and the confidence to envision life outside prison. However, these successes are fragile and often limited by the surrounding environment. Ultimately, the combination of environmental pressures, behavioral challenges, mental health issues, and limited resources makes delivering effective education and skills training at Feltham a constant battle. While opportunities exist, structural and social barriers mean that for many young offenders, learning remains secondary to survival. The working environment at HMP Feltham places officers under relentless high-pressure conditions. Staff must manage large numbers of volatile young offenders, often dealing with aggression, self-harm, and gang-related tension on a daily basis. Every decision made on the wings can have immediate consequences, creating a constant state of vigilance and stress for personnel. Officers face unpredictable behavior from inmates, who may act impulsively or strategically to challenge authority. Physical assaults, verbal abuse, and threats are frequent, requiring staff to make split-second judgments that balance safety, legal responsibilities, and the welfare of prisoners. This environment leaves little room for error, and even minor lapses can escalate into serious incidents. Long shifts and overtime are common due to staff shortages and high operational demands. Exhaustion compounds the difficulty of managing volatile populations, impacting focus, decision-making, and emotional regulation. Fatigued officers may struggle to maintain authority or respond effectively to escalating situations, increasing the risk of harm to both themselves and inmates. The psychological burden is significant. Officers frequently witness violence, self-harm, and distress among young offenders, which can lead to trauma, anxiety, or burnout. Maintaining professionalism while managing such emotional strain requires resilience and extensive training, yet high turnover often leaves newer staff less prepared to handle the intensity of Feltham's environment. Training is critical, but operational pressures often limit opportunities for development. Officers may not have consistent access to courses on conflict resolution, trauma-informed practice, or mental health interventions. This gap can reduce their effectiveness in de-escalating situations and providing support for young offenders. Decision-making in high-pressure conditions is further complicated by gang influence and complex inmate dynamics. Staff must constantly anticipate conflicts, manage rivalries, and maintain authority without escalating violence. This requires both experience and situational awareness, as one misjudged intervention can spark retaliation or undermine control. Additionally, officers must enforce rules while supporting rehabilitation efforts, a delicate balance that is difficult under extreme pressure. Security protocols, lockdowns, and emergency responses often take precedence over engagement and mentoring, creating tension between the custodial and rehabilitative aspects of their role. Ultimately, high-pressure working conditions at Feltham define the daily reality for staff. The combination of violent incidents, complex inmate behavior, limited resources, and long hours makes their role extremely demanding, requiring constant alertness, resilience, and the ability to operate effectively under stress. HMP Feltham has long been the subject of intense scrutiny from both media outlets and official inspection bodies. Reports frequently highlight serious concerns about safety, violence, staff shortages, and the welfare of young offenders, shaping public perception and putting pressure on prison management. Media coverage often emphasizes extreme incidents, such as assaults, riots, or self-harm, presenting Feltham as a high-risk and troubled institution. Official inspection reports, including those from His Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons, HMP, have repeatedly identified structural and operational issues. Overcrowding, inadequate staffing, and the prevalence of violence are recurring themes, alongside challenges in delivering education, rehabilitation, and mental health support. These reports underscore that the problems are systemic rather than isolated, reflecting deeper challenges within youth custodial institutions. Media portrayals amplify the sense of danger within Feltham. Documentaries, news stories, and investigative features often highlight the experiences of both staff and inmates, drawing attention to extreme violence, gang influence, and incidents of self-harm. While this coverage raises awareness, it also reinforces a public image of Feltham as chaotic and unsafe, sometimes overshadowing the rehabilitation efforts that do occur. Criticism often focuses on the balance, or perceived imbalance, between security and care. Inspectors and journalists have noted that strict security measures, while necessary, can limit access to education, therapy, and vocational programs, hindering rehabilitation. Overemphasis on containment may exacerbate tensions and increase fear among inmates, contributing to cycles of aggression and self-harm. High-profile incidents receive significant attention, shaping policy discussions about youth justice. Assaults on staff, large-scale fights, or self-harm cases often spark calls for reform, additional funding, or staff training. This external pressure can lead to rapid changes in operational procedures, but it also places stress on management, who must respond while maintaining daily operations in a volatile environment. Staff morale is impacted by media and inspection scrutiny. Officers may feel underappreciated or unfairly judged when reports focus on failures rather than their daily efforts to maintain safety. This can contribute to burnout, turnover, and recruitment difficulties, further compounding the challenges within the institution. Despite the criticism, some reports acknowledge pockets of success. Certain programs, interventions, and individual staff efforts demonstrate positive outcomes, though these are often overshadowed by the wider narrative of violence and instability. Nevertheless, media and inspection attention plays a crucial role in highlighting deficiencies, prompting accountability, and ensuring that Feltham's challenges remain visible to policymakers and the public. Overall, media coverage and inspection criticism reinforce Feltham's reputation as a high-risk and complex environment, shaping both public perception and operational priorities. They spotlight the extreme pressures faced by staff and the vulnerability of inmates, while simultaneously emphasizing the need for systemic reforms in youth justice. HMP Feltham has long been the focus of reform initiatives aimed at reducing violence, improving mental health support, and promoting rehabilitation among its young offender population. However, the success of these efforts has often been limited, constrained by environmental, social, and institutional challenges that persist despite policy changes or programmatic interventions. Rehabilitation programs at Feltham include education, vocational training, anger management courses, and counseling. While some inmates benefit from these programs, participation is often inconsistent due to fear, aggression, and gang pressures. Young offenders may prioritize survival over self-improvement, leaving reform initiatives struggling to reach those most in need. Gang culture within the prison significantly limits the effectiveness of reform efforts. Inmates who attempt to engage in programs may be seen as disloyal or weak by peers, discouraging participation. Conversely, those aligned with gang networks may manipulate programs to enhance status rather than achieve personal growth, further reducing genuine outcomes. Overcrowding and staff shortages amplify these challenges. Programs are disrupted by security concerns, limited supervision, and lack of resources. Classes, workshops, or therapy sessions may be postponed, overcrowded, or under-resourced, leaving reform initiatives inconsistent and fragmentary. This inconsistency undermines the long-term effectiveness of interventions. Mental health challenges also impact reform success. Many young offenders struggle with trauma, anxiety, depression, or other psychological conditions that inhibit engagement. Without sufficient individualized support, even well-structured programs cannot address the complex needs of the population, limiting their transformative potential. Despite these limitations, there are isolated successes. Some inmates complete vocational qualifications, gain work experience, or demonstrate behavioral improvements, indicating that reform is possible under the right conditions. These successes, however, are fragile and often overshadowed by the broader context of violence, instability, and systemic constraints. Institutional culture also plays a role. Officers, educators, and healthcare staff work under extreme pressure, making it difficult to consistently reinforce program objectives or provide sustained support. The daily demands of managing safety often take precedence over long-term rehabilitation goals. Ultimately, reform efforts at Feltham highlight both the potential and the difficulty of rehabilitating young offenders in a high-risk environment. While some programs show measurable benefits, the combined pressures of violence, trauma, gang influence, and limited resources mean that lasting, systemic success remains a major challenge. HMP Feltham serves as more than just a detention facility. It stands as a stark reflection of the broader challenges facing youth justice in the United Kingdom. The extreme violence, gang influence, mental health crises, and overcrowding that define daily life at Feltham are symptoms of systemic issues that extend far beyond its walls. Many young offenders arrive at Feltham already shaped by years of social disadvantage. Poverty, family breakdown, educational exclusion, and exposure to street crime create a foundation of vulnerability that the prison system must confront. Feltham, therefore, becomes a microcosm of societal failings, housing the consequences of early neglect and unmet needs. The institution struggles with staff shortages, overcrowding, and resource constraints mirror wider challenges across the youth justice system. Limited funding, recruitment difficulties, and competing demands reduce the capacity to deliver meaningful rehabilitation and maintain safety. Feltham highlights how structural deficiencies can magnify the difficulties of managing vulnerable and volatile populations. Gang culture and peer pressure inside the prison reflect persistent issues in communities outside. Conflicts that originate on the streets continue behind bars, demonstrating the porous boundary between societal crime and institutional control. The prison cannot isolate young offenders from these external influences, underscoring the need for coordinated interventions beyond custodial settings. Feltham also illustrates the psychological complexity of youth incarceration. The prevalence of trauma, mental health issues, and self-harm among inmates reveals that punishment alone is insufficient. Effective youth justice requires addressing emotional and behavioral needs, yet systemic limitations often make this impossible, leaving inmates trapped in cycles of aggression and fear. The limited success of rehabilitation programs at Feltham underscores the difficulty of transforming lives within a high-pressure environment. While some young men engage positively with education, vocational training, or therapy, these individual successes are fragile against the backdrop of violence, gang dynamics, and institutional strain. Public perception and media scrutiny of Feltham reflect wider societal debates about crime, punishment, and youth reform. Each incident of violence or self-harm becomes a focal point for policy discussion, highlighting tensions between safety, rehabilitation, and accountability. The prison's challenges reveal the complexity of balancing these objectives in youth justice. In essence, Feltham is both a physical institution and a symbol. Its environment, population, and operational pressures encapsulate the most pressing issues of the youth justice system, How society manages young offenders who are simultaneously dangerous, vulnerable, and in need of guidance. It demonstrates that addressing youth crime requires more than incarceration. It demands systemic solutions, early intervention, and a recognition of the social and psychological forces that shape behavior.